September 15th, 1942. 6.23 hours. Ravensbrück concentration camp, 80 kilometers north of Berlin. 74 Polish women stood in the camp courtyard listening to a German officer read their names from a list. Maria Kuzmierczuk, 19 years old, student nurse. Zofia Bai, 22, resistance courier. Jadwiga Zito, 26, teacher. 74 names. 74 women who had been arrested for resistance activities, smuggling messages, hiding Allied soldiers, distributing underground newspapers. Minor infractions by Nazi standards, prison sentences, maybe labor camps. Not execution. Not yet. But when the officer finished reading the list, he said something that made several women exchange glances. "You will report to the medical block at 0800 hours. Dr. Oberhäuser will explain the procedure." Medical block. Procedure. Those words meant something different in concentration camps. They didn't mean healing. They meant experimentation. Human subjects. Living tissue used to test theories that no ethical medical board would ever approve. Maria felt her stomach tighten. She'd heard rumors, whispered stories from other prisoners about what happened in medical blocks. About prisoners who went in walking and came out carried. About screams that lasted hours. About infections that killed slowly. She looked at the other women, saw the same fear reflected in their eyes. But they were Polish. Resistance members. They'd already survived arrests, interrogations, beatings. They'd already proven they wouldn't break easily. They didn't know yet that what was coming would test limits they didn't know existed. Ravensbrück was designed exclusively for women. Opened in May 1939. Located on the shores of Lake Schwedt. 130,000 women passed through its gates during the war. Political prisoners, resistance fighters, communists, Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, common criminals. All classifications mixed together in overcrowded barracks designed for 300 but holding 1,000. Rations were 500 calories per day. Just enough to keep prisoners alive, but too little to maintain strength. Work assignments lasted 12 hours, 7 days per week. Manufacturing uniforms for the Wehrmacht. Building roads. Digging trenches. Death from exhaustion, starvation, or disease was common. Expected, not documented. But death from routine deprivation wasn't fast enough for certain Nazi medical researchers. Dr. Karl Gebhardt was the senior SS physician, personal doctor to Heinrich Himmler. He'd been tasked with finding treatments for battlefield injuries that were killing German soldiers faster than they could be replaced. Infections from shrapnel wounds, gangrene from delayed treatment, bone damage that couldn't heal properly. Orthodox medical research was too slow, required years of controlled studies, ethical oversight, voluntary participants. Gebhardt didn't have years. He had direct authorization from Himmler to use concentration camp prisoners as experimental subjects. No consent required. No ethical review. No limits on what could be done. In September 1942, Gebhardt selected Ravensbrück as his primary research facility. He needed subjects. Young. Healthy. Preferably educated enough to articulate symptoms, but powerless enough that no one would object if they died. The 74 Polish women were perfect. The experiments began on September 22, 1942. Dr. Herta Oberhäuser, the only female doctor at Ravensbrück, conducted the procedures. She was 34 years old, university educated, board-certified physician, graduated from medical school in Dusseldorf in 1937. Had spent 3 years working in private practice before joining the SS Medical Corps in 1940. She'd taken the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. She violated that oath 74 times in the following 18 months. The procedure was surgically precise. Each woman was taken individually to the operating room, strapped to a table, leather restraints on wrists and ankles, given local anesthesia, but kept conscious. Oberhäuser wanted them awake to describe symptoms, to report pain levels, to provide real-time feedback on how the body responded to trauma. She made incisions in their legs, 6 to 8 inches long, cut through skin, through subcutaneous fat, through muscle tissue, removed sections of bone using surgical saws, removed sections of muscle using scalpels, removed sections of nerve tissue using forceps, then deliberately infected the wounds with bacteria cultured in the camp laboratory. Streptococcus, staphylococcus, gas gangrene, tetanus, bacteria taken from battlefield casualties, bacteria known to be fatal without proper treatment. She wanted to see how infections progressed without treatment, how long it took for sepsis to develop, what symptoms appeared first, fever patterns, tissue necrosis rates, immune system response in malnourished subjects. How much damage could the body sustain before death? Some women received sulfa drugs, the new wonder drug that was saving German soldiers. Gebhardt wanted to determine if sulfa drugs were effective against battlefield infections. He needed control groups, women who received treatment, women who received no treatment at all, who were left to suffer and possibly die so that data could be collected. Comparative analysis, scientific method applied to human subjects without consent. Maria Kusmirchuk was in the control group. Oberhäuser cut into her left leg on September 22nd, removed 3 inches of fibula bone, the thinner of the 2 lower leg bones. Not weight-bearing but structurally important. Infected the wound with Streptococcus bacteria. Strain isolated from a German soldier who had died of sepsis 3 weeks earlier. Sutured the incision loosely so infection could spread freely into surrounding tissue. Sent Maria back to the barracks without medication, without antibiotics, without pain relief. Told her to report symptoms daily. Told her if she failed to report, she would be selected for execution. Maria's leg began swelling within 12 hours. Redness spread from the incision site in concentric circles. Pain intensified from dull ache to sharp burning that made walking impossible. Fever developed. 101 Fahrenheit, 102, 103. Her body was fighting infection without antibiotics, without clean bandages, without proper nutrition. The odds were against her. Oberhäuser documented everything. Temperature readings, visual observations of wound appearance, measurements of swelling, descriptions of pus color and consistency. Maria was an experimental subject. Data point. Her survival or death would be recorded with clinical detachment in research files that Gebhardt would later present to Himmler as evidence of productive work. The other prisoners called them króliki, rabbits, the Polish word for experimental animals. It wasn't an insult, it was identification, solidarity, recognition that these women were being treated as less than human, reduced to test subjects, laboratory animals, but animals that could think, that could remember, that could resist. The rabbits were marked. Everyone in Ravensbrück knew what was happening to them, knew they were being used as test subjects, knew they were probably going to die. The survival rate for deliberate infections without antibiotics was less than 30%. The survival rate for multiple surgeries with malnutrition was even lower. But knowing and doing something about it were different things. Most prisoners kept their distance. Survival instinct, self-preservation. Association with rabbits meant association with medical experiments. That could make you the next subject. Oberhäuser needed control groups. She needed subjects. Any prisoner who showed too much sympathy might be selected. But some prisoners refused to stay silent. Refused to let the rabbits suffer alone. Refused to accept that solidarity meant death. They formed a network, secret, organized, risky. When a rabbit returned from surgery, unable to walk, other prisoners helped her to the barracks, supported her weight, carried her if necessary, changed her bandages using stolen medical supplies, gauze taken from the camp infirmary, alcohol stolen from supply closets, thread pulled from their own clothing to improvise sutures when wounds reopened, shared their already insufficient food rations. 500 calories per day wasn't enough for one person. Dividing it between two was suicide by malnutrition. But they did it anyway. Because a rabbit recovering from surgery needed calories more than a healthy prisoner. The network operated through whispers, through glances, through coded language that guards couldn't interpret. Block 10 needs bread meant a rabbit in Block 10 needed food. The inspection is early meant hide the sickest rabbits during roll call. Oberheiser is coming meant get rabbits who couldn't stand into beds before the doctor arrived for rounds. Hid the sickest rabbits during inspections so Oberheiser wouldn't see how badly the infections were progressing. Wouldn't see that her experiments were failing, that women in control groups were surviving despite lack of treatment, that survival rates didn't match her predictions. Every survival was data corruption, evidence that Nazi science was built on cruelty, not competence, that medical research conducted on unwilling, malnourished subjects produced unreliable results, that humanity could persist even in a place designed to extinguish it. The network included non-Polish prisoners, German political prisoners, Austrian communists, Czech resistance members, French survivors of Gestapo interrogations. Nationality didn't matter. The rabbits were suffering. The network responded. This wasn't just compassion, it was resistance, active resistance. Every rabbit who survived was evidence that the experiments were failing, that Nazi authority could be undermined, that prisoners retained agency even when reduced to experimental subjects. Maria's leg didn't heal. The infection spread. Her fever reached 104 degrees. Delirium set in. She hallucinated conversations with her mother, saw her childhood home, smelled food that wasn't there. Other prisoners took shifts watching her, making sure she didn't die alone, making sure her death would be witnessed and remembered. On the 7th day, the fever broke. Her body's immune system had somehow fought off the infection without antibiotics, without proper care, against all medical probability. Oberheiser documented it as an anomaly. Maria documented it as survival. The experiments continued for 18 months, September 1942 to March 1944. 74 women subjected to repeated surgeries. Some had both legs operated on multiple times. Bone removed, muscle removed, nerves severed, infections deliberately introduced. The pain was constant. Morphine was rarely given. Gebhardt wanted to observe natural pain responses, wanted to know how much suffering soldiers could endure before psychological breakdown. The women developed strategies. When Oberheiser called names for the next surgery, some women hid, switched identification numbers with prisoners who weren't on the list. It worked occasionally, but roll call was precise. Absences were noticed. Punishments were severe. Beatings, solitary confinement, reduced rations. Still, they tried, because delay meant survival. Every day not in surgery was a day the body could heal, a day closer to the war ending, a day that proved Nazi control wasn't absolute. Sophia Bai had surgery 6 times, both legs, multiple incisions, infections that nearly killed her twice. By March 1944, she couldn't walk without assistance. Her legs were covered with scars. Tissue damage was permanent. But she was alive. That was resistance in itself. By early 1944, the tide of war had shifted. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. Allied forces had landed in Italy and were preparing for invasion in France. Germany was losing. Gebhardt knew it. Oberheiser knew it. The experiments became more frantic, more extreme, as if they were racing against time to extract data before the camps were liberated. In February 1944, the order came. All rabbits were to be executed. Himmler had authorized it personally. The experiments were classified. The subjects were witnesses, living evidence of war crimes. That evidence needed to be eliminated before Allied forces arrived. Oberheuser read the execution order to the rabbits on February 4, 1944. Immediate liquidation. All 74. No exceptions. The women reacted with calculated calm. They'd been expecting this, had discussed what to do if execution orders came. They'd made plans, secret plans, resistance plans. That night the rabbits disappeared. Not literally. They couldn't escape the camp. The fences were electrified. Guards patrolled constantly. Dogs tracked movements. But they could hide. Blend into the general prisoner population. Switch barracks. Change work assignments. Other prisoners helped. Gave them different clothing. Covered for them during roll call. Lied to guards about where they were. The camp administration noticed immediately. 74 prisoners missing. But finding them among thousands was difficult. The rabbits didn't hide in obvious places. They split up, moved constantly, never stayed in one location more than a few hours. It was psychological warfare. The camp couldn't function if prisoners could simply refuse orders and disappear. Oberheuser demanded they be found. Guards conducted searches, interrogated prisoners, threatened collective punishment. No one talked. The rabbits remained hidden for 3 weeks. During that time, news arrived. British and American forces had landed in Normandy. Soviet forces were pushing toward Poland. Liberation was possible. Maybe not immediate, but possible. The executions were delayed, then postponed, then quietly canceled. Gebhardt had bigger problems. The Wehrmacht needed all available doctors for combat casualties. Research programs were being shut down. Resources redirected. The rabbits had survived through resistance, through solidarity, through the simple act of refusing to cooperate with their own murder. When Ravensbrück was liberated by Soviet forces on April 30, 1945, 49 of the original 74 rabbits were still alive. 25 had died. From infections, from surgical complications, from starvation, from execution despite the canceled order. But 49 survived. Against medical probability, against Nazi intentions, against every logical outcome. Maria Kuzmierczuk was among the survivors. Her left leg was permanently damaged. She walked with a cane for the rest of her life. But she walked. She testified at the Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1946, showed her scars to the judges, described each surgery in clinical detail, named Oberheuser, named Gebhardt, named every Nazi doctor who participated. Her testimony was devastating, precise, irrefutable. Dr. Karl Gebhardt was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, sentenced to death. Hanged on June 2, 1948. Dr. Herta Oberheuser was convicted of crimes against humanity, sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. She was released in 1952 after serving 5 years. The West German government needed doctors. Her medical license was reinstated. She practiced medicine until 1958, when rabbit survivors discovered she was treating patients. Public outrage forced her retirement. She died in 1978, never apologized, never expressed remorse, maintained until her death that she was following orders, that she was conducting legitimate medical research, that the rabbits were criminals who deserved their treatment. The rabbits disagreed. After the war, they formed an organization, the Association of Ravensbrück Rabbits. Their purpose was documentation. Every surgery, every infection, every death. They wanted the world to know exactly what had been done to them, wanted the experiments documented so thoroughly that denial would be impossible. They collected medical records that survived, interviewed each survivor, cross-referenced testimonies, built a database of evidence that even Nazi apologists couldn't dispute. They also wanted recognition, not for heroism, for survival, for resistance, for refusing to accept that their bodies could be used without consent, that their suffering could be justified by science, that their deaths could be erased from history. Sophia Ba became the organization's president. She traveled to schools, universities, medical conferences, showed her scars, told her story, answered questions from students and doctors who couldn't comprehend how physicians could violate their oaths so completely. She said the same thing every time. We were not heroes. We were victims who refused to die quietly. That refusal is resistance. That resistance is what the Nazis feared most. Not our ability to fight, our refusal to surrender our humanity, even when they tried to reduce us to experimental animals. By the 1990s, most of the rabbits had died. Age, complications from their injuries, the lasting effects of malnutrition and trauma. But before they died, they established a memorial. In Poland, in Ravensbrück itself, now a museum, plaques bearing all 74 names, survivors and dead together. The plaques don't explain the experiments in detail. They just list names, dates of birth, dates of surgery, dates of death when applicable. Simple facts. But those facts tell a story that needs no embellishment. Medical ethics today includes specific protocols designed to prevent what happened to the rabbits. Informed consent requirements, ethical review boards, international treaties prohibiting experimentation on prisoners, laws that didn't exist in 1942, laws that were written specifically because of what happened at Ravensbrück. The rabbits contributed to that. Their testimony at Nuremberg established legal precedent. Their documentation proved that medical experimentation without consent was a war crime. Their survival demonstrated that victims could become witnesses, that silence could be broken, that justice, however delayed, could be pursued. This is not a story about heroes defeating evil through courage and sacrifice. It's a story about ordinary women who were subjected to extraordinary cruelty, who endured because endurance was the only option, who resisted not through armed combat, but through solidarity, sabotage, and the simple refusal to cooperate with their own extermination. They were students, nurses, teachers, couriers, young women with futures that were stolen, bodies that were violated, lives that were permanently damaged. But they were also survivors, witnesses, resistors. They proved that even in concentration camps, even in medical experimentation blocks, even when reduced to identification numbers and experimental subjects, human beings retain agency, retain the capacity to resist, retain the ability to refuse dehumanization, even when every system is designed to enforce it. The rabbits of Ravensbrück demonstrated that power isn't always physical. Sometimes it's psychological. Sometimes resistance is surviving when you're supposed to die. Sometimes victory is living long enough to testify. Sometimes heroism is refusing to let your suffering be forgotten. The last surviving rabbit, Alfreda Piwowarska, died in 2017. She was 92 years old. She'd lived 75 years with permanent leg damage, 75 years carrying scars from 6 different surgeries, 75 years remembering friends who didn't survive. In her final interview, given 3 months before her death, she was asked what she wanted people to remember about the rabbits. She thought for a long time before answering, then said, "Remember that we were ordinary. We weren't soldiers. We weren't trained fighters. We were just women who believed Poland should be free. And for that belief, we were mutilated. But we didn't let that mutilation define us. We defined ourselves. By surviving, by testifying, by refusing to let them erase us from history. That's what I want remembered. Not that we suffered, but that we survived, and that our survival mattered. The rabbits of Ravensbrück are gone now, all 74. Survivors and victims alike. Their bodies are buried. Their names are carved in memorial stones. Their testimonies are archived in libraries and museums, but their story remains. Not as inspiration, not as heroism, but as evidence. Evidence that cruelty has limits, that resistance takes many forms, that ordinary people placed in impossible situations sometimes do extraordinary things simply by refusing to surrender. The 74 Polish women didn't defeat the Nazis, didn't liberate camps, didn't change the outcome of the war. They just survived. 49 of them, against every probability, against Nazi intentions, against medical science that said infected wounds without treatment should be fatal. They survived. And by surviving, they won. Not the war, but their war. The personal war against dehumanization, against being reduced to experimental subjects, against the idea that their suffering didn't matter. They won that war, 49 times over. And that victory, small as it might seem against the scale of World War II, was complete, absolute, permanent. Because 75 years later, we still remember their names, still tell their story, still recognize that what happened to them was wrong, that their resistance mattered, that their survival was victory. That's what the rabbits of Ravensbrück proved, that even in the darkest places, even in concentration camps, even in medical experimentation blocks designed to strip away humanity, that humanity persists. Not through grand gestures, through small acts, through solidarity, through sharing bread, through hiding the sick, through refusing to die quietly, through surviving. That's the story. That's all it needs to be. That's enough.